The Wyoming wind carried more than just dust that September afternoon in 1873. It carried the scent of heartbreak and desperation. Sarah Elizabeth Carter pulled her weathered mare to the side of the dusty trail, her hands trembling as she gripped the worn leather reins. The horse had been favoring her left foreleg for the last 5 miles, and now Sarah could see the telltale signs of a stone bruise that would leave them both stranded. "Come on, Molly, not now," she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Beside her, tied to the saddle horn, her faithful yellow mongrel dog Copper whined softly and nuzzled her arm with his wet nose. His amber eyes reflected the same uncertainty that had been eating at her for weeks through the shimmering heat. She could see endless plains stretching toward the distant Teton Mountains, their peaks already dusted with early snow. The landscape was beautiful in its vastness, but it also made her feel impossibly small and alone. 3 days ago, she'd been living in Denver with Thomas, planning their wedding, working as a seamstress in Mrs. Henderson's dress shop. Now she had $12 to her name, a lame horse, and nowhere to go. The betrayal still felt like a physical wound. Coming home early from delivering a wedding dress to surprise Thomas, only to find him in their rented room with her former best friend, Margaret. The engagement ring she'd thrown at him probably left a mark on his cheek, but not nearly the mark his infidelity had left on her heart. The words he'd shouted after her still echoed in her mind. "You were never enough for a man like me, Sarah. Too plain, too quiet, too ordinary." Copper barked suddenly, drawing her attention to a figure approaching on horseback. The rider moved with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, his silhouette dark against the golden afternoon light. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out weathered features beneath the brim of a well-worn cowboy hat and eyes the color of storm clouds. "Horse trouble, miss?" His voice was low and gravelly, like whiskey poured over gravel. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He was tall and lean with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of hard work under an unforgiving sun. Sarah slipped from her saddle, suddenly aware of how she must look. Tear-stained cheeks, hair a tangled mess beneath her bonnet, wearing the same traveling dress she'd fled Denver in. "I think Molly's picked up a stone," she said, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. The cowboy nodded and moved to examine the mare's hoof with practiced ease. Molly stood quietly for him, as if sensing his confidence. "Stone's out," he said after a moment, "but she's bruised pretty bad. How far are you planning to travel?" "I don't rightly know," Sarah admitted, the words tasting bitter as dust. "Was hoping to make it to the next town, find work of some kind." He studied her face for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion and defeat written there. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, careful. "I'm Jacob Morrison. Run a ranch about 5 miles up that road." He pointed toward a dirt track that branched off from the main trail. "Lost my ranch hand last month and I've been struggling to keep up with everything alone. Got a herd of goats that need tending, and they're more work than most people realize." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "Are you offering me work, Mr. Morrison?" "I'm offering you a place to stay and 3 meals a day in exchange for help with the animals. The goats especially. They need someone with a gentle touch and patience. You'd have your own cabin. Nothing fancy, but it's got a good roof and a stone fireplace." His eyes met hers directly. "Your dog's welcome too, long as he doesn't chase the livestock." The offer felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Sarah looked at Copper, who seemed to sense the importance of the moment. His tail gave a tentative wag as if he approved of this quiet stranger. "I don't know anything about goats, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said honestly. "I can teach you. Question is, are you willing to learn?" In the distance, thunder rumbled across the plains, promising the kind of late-season storm that could wash out roads. and strand travelers. Sarah thought about Thomas, about the life she'd built that had crumbled in a single afternoon, about the uncertain future that stretched ahead of her like the endless Wyoming sky. Yes, she said, the word carrying all the valiances, hope and fear she could muster. I'm willing to learn. Jacob nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both approval and a kind of quiet welcome. Then let's get your things. Storm's coming, and you'll want to be settled before it hits. As Sarah gathered her few possessions, a carpet bag, with her clothes, her mother's Bible, and the small sewing kit that represented her only skill, she felt something she hadn't experienced in days. The faint stirring of possibility. The wind still carried dust and the promise of rain, but now it also carried something else. The chance for a new beginning. The Morrison Ranch revealed itself gradually as Jacob's wagon bounced along the rutted dirt road, Molly tied behind him and resting her injured hoof. First came the weathered wooden fence posts, then the sprawling pastures dotted with cattle, and finally the cluster of buildings that formed the heart of the operation. The main house was a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs and stone, its covered porch welcoming despite the gathering storm clouds. Outbuildings, a barn, equipment sheds, and what looked like a small cabin scattered around the property, like pieces of a puzzle that had been carefully arranged over decades. That's yours, Jacob said, pointing to the cabin as he parked near the main house. The small structure sat beneath a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves already turning gold with the approaching autumn. Built it for my foreman back when this place was bigger. He headed to California last spring, said Wyoming was getting too lonely for his taste. Sarah studied the cabin as rain began to spatter the wagon bed. It looked sturdy and well-maintained, with a small porch and windows that faced the mountains. After sleeping under the stars for the past 2 nights, it seemed like a palace. It's perfect, she said, meaning it. Copper whined from beside her, eager to explore this new place that already smelled like home. Jacob glanced back at him with what might have been the hint of a smile. He's got good instincts. Dogs always know if a place feels right. They made quick work of moving Sarah's meager belongings into the cabin, racing against the storm that was building with typical mountain fury. The interior was simple but comfortable. A main room with a small cook stove, a bedroom barely large enough for the narrow bed, and space enough for one person to live quietly. The furniture was practical rather than fancy, but everything was clean and in good repair. Firewood stacked on the porch, Jacob said, checking the damper on the stove. Gets cold up here at night, even this time of year. You'll find blankets in the chest, and there's a root cellar out back with basic supplies. Thunder crashed overhead, closer now, and Copper pressed against Sarah's legs. She knelt to comfort him, running her fingers through his thick coat. He's not usually this nervous. It's been a hard few days for both of us. Jacob was quiet for a moment, and when Sarah looked up, she found him watching her with those storm-gray eyes. There was understanding there, and something that might have been recognition, as if he knew what it was like to have everything familiar stripped away. Why don't you both get settled tonight? He said finally. Tomorrow, I'll introduce you to the goats. Fair warning, they've got personalities. Some folks find them difficult, but I've got a feeling you might understand them. After Jacob left, Sarah sat on the small bed with Copper's head in her lap, listening to the rain drum against the roof. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, isolated from the world but not abandoned. Through the windows, she could see warm light, glowing in the main house, and somehow that made the solitude feel chosen rather than imposed. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the storm having washed the air clean. Sarah woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. She dressed quickly in her plainest work dress and the sturdy boots she'd worn for walking. Back when she'd had a normal life, then stepped out onto the porch with Copper at her side. The view took her breath away. The mountains stood sharp and clear against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the ranch spread out before her, like something from a dream. But it was the sound that made her smile, a chorus of bleating that could only be coming from the goats. Jacob appeared around the corner of the barn, carrying 2 steaming tin cups. He was dressed for work in worn denims, scuffed boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. In the morning light, Sarah could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, and the way his movements had the economical grace of someone who never wasted energy. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. The coffee was strong and black, exactly what she needed. "Thank you for the coffee and for all of this," Sarah said, gesturing toward the cabin and the peaceful morning around them. Jacob shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Let's see how you feel after you meet the girls." The goat pen was larger than Sarah had expected, with multiple sections and plenty of shelter. But it was the goats themselves that caught her attention. There were about 30 of them, all different colors and sizes, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about the newcomers. They clustered at the fence, bleating and jostling for position, their strange horizontal pupils giving them an otherworldly appearance. "They're beautiful," Sarah said, and meant it. "They're trouble," Jacob replied, but his tone was fond. "That one there with the brown patches is Dolly. She's the herd queen, and she knows it. The little black one is Pepper. She's an escape artist. And that big white one trying to eat your sleeve is Buttercup. She's sweet, but not too bright." Sarah laughed as Buttercup did indeed try to make a meal of her dress sleeve. "How did you end up with goats? Most ranchers stick to cattle." "My grandmother's idea, actually. She raised them when I was a boy. Made the best cheese in 3 counties. Jacob's expression softened with memory. "When I inherited this place, I thought about selling them, but they grow on you." As if to prove his point, Dolly pushed her way to the front of the group and fixed Sarah with a demanding stare. When Sarah reached out tentatively, the goat bumped her hand with her head, clearly asking for attention. "She likes you," Jacob observed. "That's not always a given. Goats are good judges of character." For the next hour, Jacob walked Sarah through the basics of goat care. They were more complex than she'd realized, intelligent animals with distinct personalities and needs. Some were friendly and attention-seeking, others shy or suspicious. They required different feed at different times of day, regular health checks, and constant vigilance against their tendency to find creative ways to escape or get into trouble. "The key is routine," Jacob explained as they distributed hay. "They like to know what's coming next. Change makes them nervous." Sarah found herself thinking that she and the goats had that in common. By midday, she was dirty, tired, and completely charmed. The goats had tested her. Pepper had indeed tried to escape twice. Buttercup had attempted to eat her apron, and a mischievous brown goat named Clover had knocked over a water bucket. But she'd handled each challenge with patience and growing confidence. "You're a natural," Jacob said as they walked back toward the main house. "Most people get frustrated when they don't immediately cooperate." "I worked with Mrs. Henderson's customers back in Denver," Sarah admitted. "I'm used to dealing with folks who don't always want to cooperate." Jacob nodded, filing away this piece of information about her past. "That explains the gentle hands." Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. There was approval there, and something that might have been respect. It occurred to her that Jacob Morrison was a man who didn't give either lightly. That afternoon, as Sarah worked with the goats under Jacob's watchful eye, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of purpose. The work was physical and demanding, but it felt real in a way her old life hadn't. Here, her actions had immediate, tangible results. The goats needed her, and that need was simple and honest, without hidden agendas or betrayals. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jacob appeared at the goat pen with a coffee pot and 2 cups. "Thought you might like some coffee. Evenings get cold fast up here." They sat on the fence rail watching the goats settle for the night. Copper had found a sunny spot nearby and was dozing contentedly. The quiet between them was comfortable, not awkward, the kind of silence that could exist between people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. "Thank you," Sarah said finally, "for giving me a chance." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said simply. "Sometimes the hardest part is believing you're worth it." Something in his voice suggested he spoke from experience, but Sarah didn't push. Instead, she sipped her coffee and let the peace of the evening settle around her like a warm blanket. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 3 weeks into her life at the Morrison Ranch, Sarah had fallen into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. She woke with the sunrise, fed and watered the goats, checked them for any signs of illness or injury, and spent her days learning the intricacies of their care. The work was harder than anything she'd done at Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, but it was also more satisfying. These weren't customers' complaints she was managing. These were animals that depended on her daily, and their trust was something she'd earned through consistency and care. The goats had indeed grown on her, each revealing their personality. Over time, Dolly, the herd queen, had appointed herself as Sarah's supervisor and followed her around the pen with proprietary interest. Pepper continued her escape attempts with creative persistence that Sarah couldn't help but admire. Buttercup remained sweetly dim but had developed an endearing habit of resting her chin on Sarah's shoulder while being brushed. But it was the quieter moments that meant the most, when Clover would seek her out for gentle scratches behind the ears, or when the shy goat named Sage would finally trust her enough to eat from her hand. These small victories reminded Sarah that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt with patience and time. Jacob had proven to be a thoughtful teacher, never impatient with her questions or mistakes. He had a way of demonstrating techniques without making her feel incompetent, and he seemed to understand that she needed to prove herself, not to him, but to herself. Their conversations remained sparse but comfortable, like the landscape around them. Neither pushed for personal details, but information emerged naturally in the course of shared work. She learned that Jacob had inherited the ranch from his grandfather, that he'd never married. Came close once, but ranching life isn't for everyone, and that he read voraciously during the long winter months. He learned that she'd worked as a seamstress, that she'd loved the detailed work despite difficult customers, and that she had a gift for understanding animals that went beyond mere affection. What they didn't discuss was the shadow that occasionally crossed Jacob's face when he thought no one was looking, or the way Sarah still sometimes woke in the middle of the night, with her heart racing from dreams of betrayal and harsh words. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Sarah was in the goat pen conducting her daily health checks when she noticed that Buttercup was moving stiffly. The goat allowed herself to be examined, but Sarah could feel heat and swelling in her left rear leg. "Jacob," she called, trying to keep the worry from her voice. "I think Buttercup's injured." He was beside her in moments, his hands joining hers, in a gentle examination of the leg. "Feels like a strain," he said after a careful assessment. "Probably stepped wrong coming down from the rocks. We'll need to confine her and keep that leg rested." Working together, they created a comfortable stall in the barn where Buttercup could recover. Sarah fashioned a support for the injured leg, using techniques she'd learned from watching the town veterinarian back in Denver, while Jacob prepared warm compresses and anti-inflammatory herbs. The goat submitted to their care with unusual docility, as if she understood she needed help. "You did good," Jacob said as they watched Buttercup settle into her temporary quarters. "Caught it early before it could get worse." "She's part of the family," Sarah replied simply. "Of course I'd notice if something was wrong." Jacob looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Family," he repeated softly. Over the next few days, Buttercup's care became a shared responsibility. Sarah administered treatments and changed bandages while Jacob adjusted her diet and monitored her progress. They took turns checking on her throughout the day, often arriving at the barn at the same time. It was during one of these visits, as they watched Buttercup finally put weight on her healing leg, that Jacob spoke about his past. "I was engaged once," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the goat. "Woman named Elena. Met her in town. Thought she was different from the others who saw ranch life as some kind of romantic adventure." Sarah remained silent, sensing that this was a story Jacob rarely told. "She lasted 6 months. Said the isolation was driving her crazy, that she felt like she was disappearing out here." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the old hurt underneath. "Left on a Tuesday morning while I was checking the far pasture. Took everything that mattered to her and left a note on the kitchen table." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. Jacob shrugged, but the gesture didn't hide the pain in his eyes. "Been 5 years now. Told myself I was better off alone, that this life wasn't meant for sharing. And now?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it. Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt something shift between them, like tectonic plates settling into a new configuration. "Now I'm not so sure." That evening, as they walked back from the goat pen together, Copper trotting ahead of them in the gathering dusk, Sarah found herself seeing the ranch through different eyes. The isolation that might have driven Elena away felt like sanctuary to her. The endless sky that could make some people feel small made her feel infinite. The quiet that unnerved some people felt like balm to her wounded spirit. "Jacob," she said as they reached the split in the path where she would turn toward her cabin, "would you like to have supper together tomorrow night? I mean, a real supper, not just coffee and conversation after work." His smile was slow but genuine. "I'd like that very much." The next evening, Sarah cooked supper in her small cabin. Nothing fancy, just salt pork with beans and cornbread she'd baked that morning. Jacob arrived promptly at 6, his hair still damp from washing and wearing a clean shirt that brought out the gray in his eyes. "Smells wonderful," he said, handing her a small jar. "Honey from the hives out by the creek. Been saving it for a special occasion." As they ate by lamplight with Copper sprawled contentedly by the fireplace, their conversation ranged from books to dreams they'd never shared with anyone. Sarah found herself telling Jacob about her childhood in Colorado, about her parents who'd supported her dreams even when money was tight, about the sense of purpose she'd felt when helping sick animals recover during her brief time helping the town veterinarian. "What about you?" she asked as they lingered over coffee sweetened with his honey. "What did you want to be when you were little?" "A veterinarian, actually," Jacob said with a rueful smile. "Used to patch up every stray animal I found. Drove my grandmother crazy bringing home injured birds and baby rabbits." "What changed?" "Grandfather got sick when I was 16. Someone had to run the ranch, and I was the only family he had left." Jacob swirled the coffee in his cup. "Don't regret it, exactly. This place is in my blood. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd followed that first dream." "You could still study," Sarah said gently. "It's never too late." "At 34? With a ranch to run?" "With a partner to help run it," Sarah replied, then blushed as she realized what she'd implied. Jacob set down his coffee cup and reached across the small table to take her hand. His fingers were calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was infinitely gentle. Sarah, I need you to know something. What happened to you in Denver? That wasn't about you not being enough. That was about someone who didn't deserve what you had to offer. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spilled over. How can you be so sure? Because I've been watching you for 3 weeks. I've seen how you care for those goats, how you notice when Pepper's planning an escape or when Saves needs extra attention. I've seen you get up before dawn to check on Buttercup. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. Someone who loves that completely, that selflessly. The failure wasn't yours. Later, as they sat on her small porch watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, Sarah felt something she thought was broken forever beginning to heal. Jacob's arm was around her shoulders, solid and warm, and for the first time since Denver, she felt truly safe. I was so afraid, she admitted quietly. Afraid that maybe I wasn't capable of being loved properly. You are, Jacob said with quiet certainty. You absolutely are. When he kissed her, it was with the same gentle patience he'd shown when teaching. About the goats, no rush, no pressure, just honest affection offered freely. Sarah kissed him back, tasting honey and possibility, feeling her wounded heart take its first tentative steps toward trusting again. Above them, the Wyoming sky stretched endlessly in all directions, filled with more stars than Sarah had ever seen. In the distance, she could hear the soft sounds of the goats settling for the night and Copper's gentle snoring from his spot on the porch. Everything felt perfect and peaceful and exactly as it should be. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah was exactly where she belonged. Winter came early to the Morrison Ranch that year, arriving in October with a fury that surprised even Jacob. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, transforming the landscape into something pristine and magical. Sarah watched from the barn as Jacob moved through the storm like he'd been born to it, checking water sources and ensuring the animals had adequate shelter. She'd been at the ranch for 2 months now, and the passage of time had brought changes. She couldn't have imagined that first desperate day when Molly went lame on the trail. The goats had become truly hers, not just in responsibility, but in affection. She knew each of their moods and quirks, could predict Pepper's escape attempts, and had learned to appreciate Clover's mischievous sense of humor. More importantly, she'd fallen in love, not just with Jacob, though that had happened with the inevitable force of seasons changing, but with the entire life she'd built here. The rhythm of the ranch, the satisfaction of hard work, the peace that came with sunrise over the mountains, all of it had wrapped around her heart. Like a warm quilt. Jacob had been patient with her healing, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but always making it clear that he wanted whatever she was willing to offer. Their relationship had deepened naturally, like a stream finding its course through favorable terrain. They shared meals and chores, books and quiet evenings by the fire. When she'd started spending most nights at the main house, it had felt like the most natural thing in the world. It was on a bitter morning in late November that their peaceful world was shattered. Sarah was in the barn tending to a goat with a minor cut when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. Through the open door, she could see 3 riders approaching at a gallop, their horses lathered despite the cold. Something about their urgency made her stomach clench with dread. The lead rider was a man she'd never seen before, tall and lean with cold eyes and a badge gleaming on his coat. Behind him rode 2 others who had the look of hired guns rather than lawmen. They pulled up hard in front of the main house, their horses snorting clouds of vapor in the freezing air. Jacob emerged from the house, moving with the easy confidence he always showed, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. Copper, who'd been dozing by the fire, came out beside him with his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his throat. Jacob Morrison, the lead man called out, not bothering to dismount. That's right. What can I do for you? Sheriff William Crenshaw from Laramie County. Got some questions about your land claims here. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. She'd heard stories about disputed land claims, about families driven off property they've worked for years by men with official papers and flexible morals. My claims are all properly filed, Jacob said calmly. I've been for 12 years. Crenshaw dismounted then, his movements deliberately slow and intimidating. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had never learned kindness. That's what we need to discuss. Seems there's some question about the original survey. New railroad companies coming through, and they've got surveyors saying your eastern boundary is off by near half a mile. That's impossible. My grandfather had the land surveyed proper when he filed the original claim. Well now, that was a long time ago. Papers get lost. Memories fade. Crenshaw's smile was cold as the wind. Railroad's willing to be reasonable. Though, they'll pay you fair price for the whole spread. More than it's worth, really, considering how isolated it is out here. Sarah watched Jacob's hands clench into fists at his sides. This was his family's land, his life's work, his very identity. The thought of losing it would be like asking him to cut out his own heart. This ranch isn't for sale, Jacob said quietly. Not to the railroad, not to anyone. Crenshaw's expression hardened. That's unfortunate, Morrison. Railroads got legal right to take what they need for the greater good. Eminent domain, they call it. Course, that gets messy. Takes time. Much easier if you just took their generous offer. I said no. Think carefully, Crenshaw said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. A lot of things can happen to a man living way out here alone. Animals can wander off. Buildings can catch fire. Accidents can happen. His gaze shifted toward the barn where Sarah stood frozen. Pretty little seamstress you got helping out. Shame. If something happened to her too. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water. Not for herself, but for what she could see happening to Jacob. His whole body had gone rigid with suppressed fury, and she knew he was calculating whether he could take all three men. You're making a mistake. Crenshaw, Jacob said, his voice deadly quiet. No, Morrison. You're the one making the mistake. You got 3 days to think it over. After that, well, he shrugged and remounted his horse. Like I said, lots of accidents happen out here in the winter. The three men rode off as suddenly as they'd come, leaving Jacob and Sarah standing in the churned snow of the yard. Copper was still growling, his instincts telling him these men meant harm to his pack. Jacob, Sarah said softly, approaching him like she would a spooked horse. What are we going to do? He turned to her then, and she saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. For the life they'd built together. For everything he held dear. We're going to fight, he said simply. This is our land, our home. I won't let them take it. But as they stood there, in the bitter wind, Sarah could see the weight of the world settling on Jacob's shoulders. They were alone out here, miles from help, facing men with badges and guns and the backing of powerful interests. The odds were stacked against them in ways that made her heart sick with dread. That night, as they sat by the fire planning their next move, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't let the man she loved lose his family's legacy without a fight. And she had skills and connections that Jacob didn't know about yet. Skills that might just level the playing field. Tell me everything about the original land claims, she said, pulling out paper and pen. Every detail you can remember. If we're going to fight this, we need to be smart about it. Jacob looked at her with something approaching wonder. Sarah, this isn't your fight. You could leave, go somewhere safe. This ranch is my home now, she interrupted firmly. You're my family. Their fight is with both of us, and we're going to face it together. Outside, the wind howled through the pines like a warning of the battle to come. But inside, by the warm fire with copper at their feet and their heads bent. Over legal documents, Sarah felt the familiar stirring of determination. She'd rebuilt her life once from nothing. She'd be damned if she'd let anyone take it away now. The 3 days that followed, Sheriff Crenshaw's visit passed like a fever dream. Sarah threw herself into research with the focused intensity she'd once reserved for her most delicate sewing projects. She sent copper running to neighboring ranches with carefully worded messages, asking seemingly innocent questions about land boundaries and railroad surveys. She rode Molly, now fully healed, into town twice, speaking quietly with shopkeepers and clerks who might have access to public records. What she discovered made her blood boil. Crenshaw wasn't working alone. The sheriff was in the pocket of the Western Mountain Railroad Company, a subsidiary of the massive Union Pacific. They'd been systematically targeting small ranchers along their proposed route, using intimidation and fraudulent surveys to drive families off land that had been in their possession for decades. 3 other ranches in the county had already fallen to their tactics. Their owners either bought out for pennies on the dollar or simply abandoning their claims in fear. But Sarah had learned something else, something that made her heart race with possibility. Back in Denver, she'd done more than just sew pretty dresses. Mrs. Henderson's shop had catered to the wives of judges, politicians, and businessmen. While fitting gowns and taking measurements, Sarah had heard conversations that weren't meant for her ears. She'd learned about the intricate web of contracts and land deals that drove the territory's growth, and she'd learned who could be trusted and who couldn't. More importantly, she remembered something specific about the Western Mountain Railroad Company. During a fitting for the territorial governor's wife, she'd overheard a heated conversation about railroad contracts. The company had been operating without proper federal approval for their land acquisitions. They were counting on being able to legitimize their holdings retroactively, but that required keeping their activities quiet until the paperwork went through. "Jacob," she said on the second evening, spreading her notes across the kitchen table. "I think we can beat them, but we need help." He looked up from cleaning his rifle, a task that had become grimly necessary in the past few days. "What kind of help?" "Legal help and political help. I know someone in Denver who might be able to assist us, but I'd need to send a telegraph message." Jacob studied her face in the lamplight. "Sarah, who exactly were you working for back in Denver?" She took a deep breath. "Mrs. Henderson's dress shop catered to the territorial elite. I heard things, learned things. The governor's wife, Mrs. Campbell, is a good woman who despises corruption. If we can get word to her about what's happening here, she might be able to influence her husband to investigate. That's a big risk. If Crenshaw finds out you're trying to go over his head, the risk is bigger if we do nothing." Sarah leaned forward intently. "Jacob, these men are counting on us being isolated and helpless. They don't expect us to have connections or knowledge about how their system works. That's our advantage." The next morning, Sarah rode to town alone despite Jacob's protests. The telegraph office was run by an elderly man named Peterson, who'd known Jacob's grandfather. Sarah composed her message carefully, addressing it to Mrs. Campbell, but signing it with a code name she and the governor's wife had used during their private conversations about territorial politics. "Unusual land surveys in Wyoming County," she wrote. "Local sheriff collaborating with Western Mountain Railroad to force sales without federal approval. Families losing generational holdings through intimidation. Request investigation by proper authorities." Peterson raised his eyebrows as he read the message. "You sure about this, miss? That's some serious accusations you're making." "Dead sure, Mr. Peterson. And there's another message I need to send." This one went to a clerk in the Territorial Land Office who owed her a favor from her Denver days. "Need copies of original Morrison Ranch survey, and all Western Mountain Railroad federal permits for Wyoming County operations. By the time Sarah returned to the ranch, she found Jacob waiting with news of his own. "Talk to the Hendersons and the Martinez families," he said, referring to their nearest neighbors. "Crenshaw's been to see them too. Offered them money for information about our operations, our routines. They turned him down, but it's clear he's planning something." That evening brought their answer. Crenshaw returned with a larger group. 6 men this time, all armed and wearing badges of questionable authority. They didn't bother with pleasantries. When they kissed, it tasted like victory and new beginnings, with Copper barking joyfully around them and the goats bleating their approval from the fence line. The sun broke through the gray clouds just then, painting the snow-covered ranch in shades of gold, and promise. Word of Crenshaw's arrest spread through the territory like wildfire. But Sarah and Jacob soon learned that defeating one corrupt sheriff didn't mean their troubles were over. 3 weeks after the marshals had led Crenshaw away, a new threat emerged, one that struck even closer to home. Sarah was in town collecting supplies when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 men in expensive suits were speaking quietly at the general store counter, apparently unaware that the simple ranch woman browsing fabric nearby was listening to every word. Crenshaw was a fool, the taller man was saying. Too heavy-handed, too obvious. The railroad learned their lesson from that debacle. "So what's the new approach?" his companion asked. "Subtlety, legal pressure, economic warfare. Can't drive them off with badges and guns? Fine. Cut off their access to markets, their credit, their supplies. Make it impossible for them to operate profitably. They'll sell voluntarily within 6 months." Sarah's hands clenched around the bolt of cloth she'd been examining. The Western Mountain Railroad hadn't given up. They'd simply changed tactics. And somehow, she suspected the Morrison Ranch was still squarely in their crosshairs. Her suspicions were confirmed the very next day when Jacob returned from town with a grim expression and a letter in his hand. "Bank's calling in our loan," he said without preamble. "Says there's been a reassessment of risk factors related to our operation." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "But we've never missed a payment. We've been early on every installment." "Doesn't matter. They want the full balance within 30 days, or they'll foreclose." Jacob sank into a chair at the kitchen table, looking older than she'd ever seen him. "It's $1,500, Sarah. We don't have that kind of money." Over the next week, the campaign against them escalated with surgical precision. The merchant who'd always bought their goat cheese suddenly had supply concerns and canceled their contract. The feed supplier claimed credit issues and demanded cash payment for all future orders. Even the town veterinarian, the same man who taught Sarah so much about animal care, regretfully informed them that he could no longer provide services to their ranch due to scheduling conflicts. But it was the visit from Thomas Whitman, the railroad's new representative, that revealed the full scope of their enemy's reach. Whitman arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a fine buggy pulled by matched bay horses, dressed like a gentleman and speaking with the cultured accent of the eastern cities. Unlike Crenshaw's crude intimidation, Whitman wielded influence like a rapier, precise, elegant, and devastatingly effective. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Carter," he said, tipping his hat politely. "I'm Thomas Whitman, representing the interests of several business entities in the territory. I understand you've been having some financial difficulties lately." "Nothing we can't handle," Jacob replied evenly, though Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. Of course. Independent ranchers are the backbone of this territory's growth. That's precisely why I'm here." Whitman's smile was as warm and genuine as a snake's. "My associates and I have been authorized to make you a very generous offer for your property, considerably more than market value. and certainly more than enough to satisfy any outstanding debts. "This ranch isn't for sale," Sarah said firmly. "Ah, but Miss Carter, surely you understand the realities of business? Your cheese buyer has found alternative suppliers. Your credit has become questionable. The bank, as I understand it, is requiring immediate settlement of your loan." Whitman spread his hands in a gesture of false sympathy. "Without income, how long can you realistically expect to maintain this operation?" "Long enough," Jacob said quietly, but Sarah could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not your enemy. In fact, I'm offering you a way to walk away from this situation with your dignity intact and money in your pocket. Enough to buy another ranch somewhere else. Start fresh without the burden of debt." After Whitman left, promising to return in a week for their answer, Sarah and Jacob sat in their kitchen, facing the harsh arithmetic of their situation. Without their cheese contract, they had no steady income. With the bank demanding immediate payment, they faced losing everything they'd fought to save. "Maybe he's right," Jacob said finally, the words seeming to cost him physical pain. "Maybe. It's time to cut our losses and start over somewhere else." "No." Sarah's voice was flat and final. "This is our home. This is where we belong. I won't let them win through economic pressure what they couldn't take through force. Sarah, be practical. How are we supposed to come up with $1,500 in 3 weeks?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities and calculations. Then, slowly, a plan began to form. Dangerous, desperate, but just possibly brilliant enough to work. "Jacob," she said carefully, "what do you know about the territorial laws regarding business partnerships and incorporation?" "Not much. Why?" "Because I think I know how we can beat them at their own game. But it's going to require taking some very big risks, and I'll need you to trust me." "Completely." Jacob looked at her across the table. This woman who'd arrived at his ranch with nothing but a lame horse and a broken heart, who'd helped him fight off corrupt lawmen and defend their land against powerful interests, who'd proven herself again and again to be stronger, smarter, and more resourceful than anyone had given her credit for. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. Sarah smiled then, the expression fierce and determined. "I need paper, ink, and access to the telegraph office." "And Jacob?" "We're going to need to call in every favor, every connection, and every ounce of goodwill we've built in this territory." "What are you planning?" "We're going to give Mr. Whitman and his railroad friends and what happens when you underestimate a seamstress who knows how to thread a needle." As Sarah began sketching out her plan, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced since Crenshaw's first visit: hope. Whatever his future wife was plotting, he had a feeling Thomas Whitman was about to discover that economic warfare worked both ways. The final battle for the Morrison ranch was about to begin. Sarah's plan unfolded over the next 2 weeks with the precision of her finest needlework. Working 18-hour days, she sent telegrams to every contact she'd made in Denver, called in favors from the wives of territorial officials, and leveraged her growing reputation as the woman who'd helped bring down Sheriff Crenshaw. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Mrs. Campbell herself. "My dear," the governor's wife wrote in response to Sarah's carefully worded telegram, "your situation has aroused considerable interest in certain circles. It seems the Western Mountain Railroad has made enemies beyond just small ranchers. Several established businesses have complained about their heavy-handed tactics, and there's growing sentiment that something must be done." What Mrs. Campbell didn't say directly, but what Sarah read between the lines, was that the territorial government was looking for a way to publicly demonstrate their commitment to protecting honest citizens from corporate bullying. The Morrison ranch had become a symbol, and symbols had power. The plan Sarah devised was audacious in its simplicity. If the railroad wanted to wage economic war, she'd give them an economic battle they weren't prepared for. Using her connections and the growing sympathy for their cause, she began organizing what she called the Territorial Cooperative, a network of small ranchers, farmers, and business owners who would pool their resources and purchasing power to bypass the traditional supply chains that the railroad controlled. You see, Sarah explained to Jacob as they worked late into the night preparing incorporation papers, they're counting on us being isolated, each family fighting alone. But what if we're not alone? What if we band together? The cheesemaker, who'd canceled their contract. He was facing the same pressure from the railroad because his brother-in-law had refused to sell his farm. The feed supplier demanding cash payments. He was being squeezed because he wouldn't give the railroad shipping company preferential rates. The veterinarian who couldn't provide services. The railroad had threatened to block his supply of medicines. If he continued treating problem ranchers, one by one, Sarah reached out to these victims of the railroad's campaign, offering them something the corporate interests couldn't: solidarity, shared risk, and the promise of long-term independence. From the very companies that were trying to control them, the response exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. Within 10 days, she had commitments from 43 families and businesses to join the cooperative. More importantly, she had signed agreements for the purchase and distribution of goat cheese, wool, grain, and other agricultural products that would provide the Morrison ranch with income far exceeding what they'd lost. But the masterstroke came when Governor Campbell himself, acting on his wife's suggestion, announced the formation of a territorial commission to investigate anti-competitive business practices. Thomas Whitman and the Western Mountain Railroad suddenly found themselves facing official scrutiny at the worst possible moment. When Whitman returned to the ranch as promised, he found a very different situation than he'd expected. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Carter," he began with his usual polished confidence, "I trust you've had time to consider our generous offer." "We have indeed," Sarah replied sweetly. "In fact, we've been quite busy. Perhaps you'd like to hear about our new business ventures?" As Sarah explained the cooperative, the new contracts, and the expanded market opportunities they'd secured, she watched Whitman's face grow progressively paler. The railroad's entire strategy had been based on isolating and pressuring individual families. They had no plan for dealing with an organized response that turned their victims into a unified economic force. "You see, Mr. Whitman," Sarah continued, "you made a fundamental error in your approach. You assumed we were helpless because we were small. But small doesn't mean weak when you have friends." Furthermore, Jacob added, producing a thick folder of documents, "Our legal counsel has reviewed the territorial laws regarding corporate intimidation and restraint of trade. It seems your company's recent activities may have crossed several lines that could result in substantial penalties." Whitman's composure finally cracked. "You can't fight the railroad indefinitely. We have resources you can't imagine." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged, "but we have something you don't: the support of our community and the backing of territorial authorities who are very interested in making an example of corporate bullies." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the goat pen where Dolly was holding court with her usual regal dignity. "This ranch has been in Jacob's family for 2 generations. It'll be in our family for 2 more, and our children's children after that. You can take your generous offer back to your employers, Mr. Whitman. Tell them the Morrison Ranch isn't for sale at any price." After Whitman left, driving his fine buggy considerably faster than he'd arrived, Sarah and Jacob stood on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their entire courtship and struggle. "I can't believe it worked," Jacob said, still shaking his head in amazement. "It worked because it was right," Sarah replied simply. "Sometimes the best way to fight power is to build your own." 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning with us, wildflowers blooming in the meadows and the goats frolicking in their expanded pasture. Sarah Elizabeth Carter became Sarah Elizabeth Morrison in a ceremony held right there on the ranch. The entire territorial cooperative attended, along with Governor and Mrs. Campbell, Marshall Davies, and half the population of 3 counties. The bride wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric purchased through the cooperative's buying power. The groom wore his grandfather's best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Copper served as an unofficial ring bearer, carrying the wedding bands in a small pouch tied to his collar dot as they exchanged vows under the endless Wyoming sky. With the Teton Mountains standing eternal witness to their promises, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd arrived with nothing but a broken heart and a lame horse. Now she was surrounded by family, not just Jacob, but the entire community they'd helped build and strengthen. The Western Mountain Railroad had eventually abandoned their expansion plans for this section of Wyoming, finding the legal and political obstacles too costly to overcome. Thomas Whitman had been reassigned to a desk job in Kansas City. The territorial cooperative had grown into a permanent organization that provided economic security and political influence for small farmers and ranchers throughout the region. But for Sarah, the greatest victory was simpler and more personal. As she stood beside Jacob, promising to love and honor him for all the days of her life, she knew she'd found something she'd never dared hope for. A place where she belonged completely, work that mattered deeply, and love that was built on the solid foundation of shared dreams and daily choice. The goats bleated their approval from the pasture, Dolly leading the chorus with her usual authority. Copper barked joyfully as the couple kissed, sealing their union. And high above them all, an eagle circled the peaks of the Tetons, riding the mountain winds with effortless grace. Sarah Morrison, seamstress, goat tender, community organizer, and victorious defender of home and hearth, had never been happier to be exactly where she was. The ranch hummed with the contentment of a place that was truly home, and the future stretched ahead of them like the endless Wyoming sky, full of possibility and promise. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the mountains, bringing the promise of spring rain to nourish the land they'd fought so hard to keep. But this time, the sound held no threat, only the eternal rhythm of seasons changing, life continuing, and love enduring in the heart of the American frontier. The end.